wine, art, romance, and the Beatles. The Beatles? Presenting America's most unusual vineyard, owned and operated by the man who, with little experience but major determination, changed forever the way Americans regard fine wine produced in America. All this after a career as one of the nation's great magazine illustrators. A Norman Rockwell-trained artist who painted not only the Beatles, but Elvis and a certain former president as well. Stay with us when we return with more about this amazing vineyard and its extraordinary owner. Only an hour north of Manhattan, on the western slopes of New York State's fabled Hudson Valley, lies a secret France. The BenMarl Winery in Marlborough, New York, the oldest continuously producing vineyard in America. It is owned and operated by Mark Miller, one of the earliest pioneers of the Hudson Valley wine industry, who helped change America's tastes in American wine.
I believe that I'm the person who brought the first Chardonnay into America. Whether that's a crime or something wonderful is going to take history to determine.
BenMarl is really a tribute to the tenacity, to the optimism of one man, Mark Miller, who created it back in about 30-some years ago, and has kept it going in spite of all kinds of odds right up until present time.
He had the vision to see what the wine industry could become.
Against incredible odds, Mark Miller also fought New York State bureaucracy to help spearhead a thriving wine industry that has saved thousands of Hudson Valley farmland acres from the blight of suburban sprawl.
And I had persuaded the governor of New York that the grape industry of New York could grow into a much better farming activity than we were making use of it.
A legendary Norman Rockwell-trained magazine illustrator, Mark also painted portraits of the Beatles, Elvis Presley, and former President Richard Nixon, all seen here for the first time on television. Under this same roof lies an important museum in the making, a time capsule of over 1,000 hand-painted illustrations from the 1950s and 60s, waiting their turn to be digitally archived in a fight against time and decay.
I felt a strong responsibility to make a record of that period of illustration. I had to learn how to operate a computer in order to do it.
Above all, Mark Miller is the last of the Romantics, a breed of person rapidly disappearing from the 21st century experience. This boy from Oklahoma, who grew up to become recognized by the French themselves for his fine American wines.
They made me a member of this Confrérie des Chevaliers de Tattevin.
This spiritual son of France who came home to found an American winery with French standards.
I must say it took me quite a while to learn how to pronounce it that well.
How did he get here from there? Born in the dusty little town of El Dorado, Oklahoma, Mark was the treasured oldest grandson of a homesteader who had made his fortune in the 1889 Oklahoma land rush.
My grandfather, Thorpe, stood on the edge of Indian Territory when they opened Oklahoma. He was an adventurer. He stood on the edge of Indian Territory when they fired the pistol. And then he ran in and started claiming land.
It was expected that Mark would grow up to manage the family's land holdings, but this was not to be.
Because I worked in my father's drugstore, and when things got pretty cool in the evening and there wasn't much to do, I would sit in one of the back stools and draw some pictures.
On his own, Mark entered a competition for a scholarship to art school in California and won.
I went to California and began to study magazine illustration. The world was out there really waiting.
He would study with some of the greatest illustrators of the time, including Norman Rockwell.
However, The family intended for me to come back and run the farms, so that no great amounts of spending money was made available. And California was loaded with pretty girls. I was 19 years old. You can see that there was a problem there. So with the help of a friend, I went out to 20th Century Fox, who was about to start a motion picture called The Black Swan. Made a few pirate pictures from an old book and got a job. My first paid opportunity as a painter.
But the boy from Oklahoma had his sights set on New York. America after World War II was a nation engaged with life. It was a giddy time of romance, babies, suburbs, appliances. It was the golden age of advertising. Mark quickly found work as an illustrator of romance stories in magazines such as Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, McCall's. He had found his niche as an artist. He would ultimately become one of the major magazine illustrators of his time. Born during Prohibition, raised by hard-working, devout Methodists, the young Mark had nonetheless discovered wine in his California days. Now he was developing a new dream, to own a working vineyard, to live a life not defined by office walls. In 1957, Miller purchased 35 acres of flinty, hard-scrabble hillside, lined with ancient grapevines, in the town of Marlborough in eastern Ulster County, overlooking the Hudson.
Settled first in the 1700s, when the old town of Marlborough was named after the Duke of Marlborough. But it was settled by non-wine drinking people, the Scots and the Irish. And so the grapes had no dramatic value to them except for marketing them. They would ship them down to New York and sell them as fresh fruit.
It was the oldest continuously producing vineyard in America. Miller named it BenMarl, in Gaelic, Ben for hill, and Marl for its slaty soil.
With a great climate like we have here in the Hudson Valley, there's no reason why America couldn't get involved in the production of some of the world's finest wines.
But the need for money would put Miller's dream of a vineyard on hold for the next 10 years. The American advertising industry was increasingly turning to television rather than illustration. Most of his commissions were now coming from Europe, where television had not yet made inroads. Reluctantly, Miller left BenMarl in the hands of a caretaker and crossed the Atlantic.
One of the interesting things about being an American artist, generally a romance artist living in Europe, was that occasionally I would be given an assignment to explain some other part of American society. For example, when Mr. Nixon ran for office the first time, there were a lot of people who were interested in him as an American president. They were interested in almost everything that happened in America. So that in order to give it some reality, they called on an American artist to paint a portrait of Richard Nixon. Well, I found out that there were lots of different opinions about what Mr. Nixon looked like and what kind of a person he was. So here's just a little sample of some of the Nixon portraits that I did for various clientele in Europe.
Another American, Elvis Presley, was making worldwide headlines with his engagement to Priscilla.
Yes, this is the first portrait that I ever painted of a major entertainer, not of my own age.
But Miller almost turned down the commission.
I thought that was the strangest noise. Remember, here I am, a young American who didn't really know anything about that at all. Bing Crosby was my type.
Then, the Beatles were poised to take the world by storm.
When my partner said that he would like to have me paint the Beatles because there was a magazine in London who would like to publish a story about them. And so I said, really, I've just gotten here, it's nice and warm, I hate to come back up here to London at that time of year. Why don't you just have somebody photograph for them? He said, well, I can take care of that, but I want you to see these people. I want you to see what they're like. So that I said, okay, Albert.
Published in many magazines in the early 60s, these portraits are appearing here for the first time on television.
Here I was perfectly capable of painting some beautiful young woman of that time. But I painted the very opposite of what I would like. But it turned out that these figures, these faces, turned out to be some of the most famous faces ever painted.
But Miller's dream of his own vineyard was never far from his thoughts. Increasingly, he was stealing time from the income-producing artwork, deep in the seductive golden vineyards of the Burgundy region of France, where he was acquiring firsthand the ancient skills he would need to create fine wine back home.
And I had learned to love it. I had learned to love the concept of wine as being a part of a meal, and the relationship between aspects of wine, aspects of different types of food, the complexity of dining in France and other parts of Europe. That became my model.
At last, in 1967, he returned to his beloved BenMarl in the Hudson Valley. It was time to make the dream real.
He had the vision to see what the wine industry could become here in the United States. It was in its infancy.
In 1967, as Miller writes in his book, Wine, A Gentleman's Game, the state of viniculture in Eastern America was at its lowest ebb. The large established New York wineries were still making the sweet grapey confections which had never found, and could never find, a place on serious wine drinkers' tables. And worse, they had given all New York wine a poor and deteriorating reputation.
This was America's first move into winemaking in a truly European manner.
Before Miller left for Europe, he had already experimented enough to know that conditions in the Hudson Valley were ideal for the production of fine wine.
He brought over the hybrids, the vinifera from Europe, brought people over to check the soils, the climate, to see which would grow.
Miller had tried, with little success, to persuade his fellow farmers in the region to invest in planting wine grapes. Because the big upstate wineries were not buying the full production of grape growers, demand was low and prospects bleak. Some of the best fruit land was being sold off to developers. Young people were deserting farms their families had worked for generations, for jobs in town or the cities.
And he took it upon himself to redevelop this whole vineyard through terracing. It took a lot of work.
Miller was gambling that Americans would one day appreciate and be willing to pay for fine, individually made wines, rather than the big, mass-marketed blends of California wines and those made from Eastern juice and jelly grapes. He decided to encourage Hudson Valley farmers by shaping BenMarl into the role model of a farm winery. He decided that he would spark the renaissance of wine growing in the region and help keep the valley green and rural at the same time.
He kind of turned the wine industry around in the eastern United States, probably even to the mid part of the country. And so that he had quite a vision.
But first, Miller would have to create a demand for the grapes. And before he did that, there was the ever-present question,
how are we going to finance all of this? And he came upon the idea of like a country club without the golf, as he describes it, in which people would own a vine right. And that vine, 2 vines actually, would produce enough wine for 1 case, which would be that person's wine.
And so Miller hatched the Société des Vignerons, the first in a series of increasingly sophisticated investment plans to keep BenMarl going until it became a true business and could pay for itself. The Société made BenMarl's idealistic goals achievable. They could now attract media attention, raise funds, gain credibility, and create demand. By the mid-1970s, Miller had exchanged his former hobby, winemaking, for his profession. He was now a real winemaker. Even better,
with the political power that we had with the governor and his Secretary of Agriculture, we aroused an enormous amount of enthusiasm and got around this, began to plant these varieties, and started a concept of understanding of wine's potential that has grown into an enormous industry now.
On June 4, 1976, the Farm Winery Bill of New York State was signed, and Mark Miller received license number 1. The bill removed multiple layers of old-fashioned restrictions on the making and selling of wine, and included provisions for lessening prohibitive licensing fees. The door was opened to what is now known as the boutique farming movement of the Hudson Valley that includes wineries, artisanal goat cheese makers, herb growers, fallow deer ranchers, thus preserving many of the valley's heritage farms from the jaws of the bulldozer. Miller had triumphed in ways far beyond his original dreams.
If there is one major contribution that Mark has made to the wine business, it's being a great champion of the farm winery law in New York State, which makes it possible for people to have small wineries and to contribute to the wine business. Not only contribute to the wine business, but to keep vast areas of what might be land going to developers in agriculture.
So, you can see that a winemaker doesn't just sip that stuff all day long. Every now and then, it's a good idea to get out and help Mother Nature to make the vines grow. Now, we're planting some new varieties of grapes here. This is going to be a Chardonnay, and in order to get it started, it grows in a tube like this. But it has to be separated so that the tractor will come along in the future and cut the weeds away. But right now, it's better for me to come out here and not risk the damage to the plant itself and do it by hand. That just reminds me that tractors may be able to do a lot, but when it finally comes to it, a man with a hoe has a place in the vineyard even today.
BenMarl is alive with Miller's own sculptures, all daily tangible reminders of the years in France. Miller takes us into his private cellar containing 40 years of quietly aging BenMarl wines.
This is the room where we lay down a few bottles every year. For the past 40 years, we've been laying things down here to see whether or not they age well. And in order to give me a little bit of help, you notice this old boy here? This is a piece of sculpture that was done by me to be a kind of a symbol of the Burgundians that had taught me so much.
Miller's attention to sculptural detail extended to structural as well.
We're standing in the first part of the winery. We had first built a building that would be my studio, and underneath it we were going to start this new part of my career that I had fallen in love with in Burgundy. So it was all built with arches in order to dramatize the fact that it was taking its initiation and its encouragement from the world of France and the world of wine that I had learned to love so much.
Today, Miller is adventuring once again, this time into the world of museums.
During the last few years, I've come to be aware that I was possibly one of the very last of the major magazine illustrators of the world.
Here in BenMarl's winery building, a stone's throw from the apparatus of bottling, corking, and foiling, lie the beginnings of the Museum for the Preservation of Illustrative Art, recently chartered by the state of New York. A larger permanent structure is planned for the future.
Illustrated painting is not like any others. Illustrated painting is about the way we were as a culture, as a nation, and it's become a fascinating fixation for me.
Nearly 1,000 hand-painted illustrations from the glossy publications of the 1950s and 60s. Their paper, inks, and pigments existing in a fragile balance between air and time await digital archiving.
But now I spend a great deal of my time, especially in the wintertime, copying the original works of famous illustrators, even the way they appeared in magazines, putting those things into discs, and eventually going into a museum which we plan to build, so that people will be able to look back on this part of time.
Miller has spent much of his adult life as an illustrator of high romance, the stylized belief system where boy meets girl, boy marries girl, boy and girl live happily ever after, that reached its apotheosis in Hollywood movies of the 1950s and early 60s. Miller has twice lived out that very dream. His first wife died when he was in his 60s.
I lost a lovely wife. My children had grown off into their own lives. And one day, a lady came to visit.
And I came to work, I think, for about 3 months, and by that time we were engaged.
Winemaking is only for the patient and the wise. Applause for Miller and his efforts to put BenMarl on the world wine map did not consistently begin appearing until almost a decade after his return from Europe.
You'd have to say that Mark Miller is really unique in his position in the American wine industry. It moves along on a different pace because the big commercial wineries in California and Washington State and Oregon, they have a huge public.
Miller would have to wait almost 13 years for Pryle's big gesture. Quote, "The father of the Hudson Valley's modern wine renaissance and the Valley's best-known winemaker is Mark Miller of BenMarl Vineyards."
He's a creative person. Wine is a creative product. It's not just a staple. It takes somebody with sensitivity and culture to do it, as it always has in Europe. And that is what he brought to his little establishment up there, not just in the vineyards, but in his museum, in his house. It's a worthwhile life that he's lived.
At an assembly of wine industry professionals at the United Nations in 1985, the renowned French enologist Émile Peynaud saluted Mark Miller as one of the world's 20 best winemakers. Only 2 other Americans, Californians, were included on Peynaud's list. Not bad for a boy from Oklahoma.
I think my life has just been one unexpected venture to another. Sometimes I wonder if the good stuff isn't still ahead of us.
Mark Miller, a man who, though he can remember horse and buggy, gallops with certitude into the digital age. A man of a certain time, yet perpetually, paradoxically, a step ahead of all the times. A man who ran away from his grandfather's vast farms on the Oklahoma prairie, only to become a farmer himself on the vertical hillsides of the Northeast Hudson Valley. A man who exchanged his profession, art, for his hobby, wine, spurred the growth of a new economy in his adopted state, and helped put American-made fine wine on the map of the world, all in the oldest vineyard in America.